I'm going to kick off now with Douglas Carswell, who I'm sure doesn't need much introduction. He was a former MP for the Conservative Party in UKIP and played a pivotal role, I think, in winning a referendum for this country and pushing for the Leave votes in the EU referendum. And he's also somewhat of an expert in digital democracy. He's written a book called, I think, The End of Politics and the Birth of iDemocracy, is that right? So if you'd like to give a warm welcome to Douglas Carswell.
Thank you for that. This time last year we were in the middle of the referendum campaign, and on my side of that campaign we had as our slogan the phrase "take back control" or "take control." We had that as our slogan very deliberately. If you remember the website, it didn't just say voteleave.com, it said vote leave, take control. We very deliberately used the phrase again and again, take control, take back control. And we didn't just do that by accident. We had focus group tested it, we had looked at what different audiences thought of it, and it was part of a very deliberate message. Now, you might think that the idea of taking control was somehow retro, that it somehow appealed to a backward-looking mood of the country. But I would argue very strongly that the idea of taking control actually had a very contemporary resonance. It appealed to sections of the electorate who feel that they don't have control. We're often told that Eurosceptics are people who are reactionary, who reject modernity. The first point I really want to make is that I think modernity actually makes possible many of the changes that we're seeing politically, whether we like them or not. To diagnose them as old-fashioned and fuddy-duddy and reactionary is to miss the point. Digital has, I think, profoundly changed, and I speak as someone who was a constituency MP for Clacton for 12 years. Digital has profoundly changed the expectations of many, many people. And in ways that I think we might find surprising. If you've only ever known people to have mobile phones and the ability to go online and look at their bank accounts whenever they want, you may not appreciate the extent of this change, but it's very, very significant. When I was growing up, there were 4 TV channels, and a remote producer decided what it was that people watched on a Friday evening, and everyone would talk about it because pretty much everyone you knew watched that program. What digital now does is it allows people to watch what they want, when they want to watch it, and that's become a cultural norm. Spotify allows us to listen to what we want, when we want to listen to it. We can shop online and get what we want when we want it. Groceries delivered at a time that suits us. Self-selection, in other words, the idea of having control, is becoming a cultural norm. And this is a hugely, hugely important change. It's not just trivial stuff to do with music and TV. It fundamentally transforms the people's expectations of their relationship with government. The relationship between the governed and the governing is changing, whether or not the people in power realise it or want it. It's not just about the idea of people having control, it's democratised the process of forming opinions. For many, many years in this country, like in all Western democracies, a small elite of people, the kind of people who perhaps edit the Today programme, or select who goes on Newsnight, decided what the parameters of public discourse were. They framed the debate. When I say they're biased, I don't mean in a partisan sense, but the outlooks that they had didn't reflect the views of ordinary people. We still have that commentariat, and it still sometimes comes as a surprise to them to discover that they're not in touch with the electorate. But they are no longer central to our democracy. They're increasingly incidental to it. Often, when I listen to public intellectuals complaining about things they don't like, it's really the complaint of those who recognise that as public intellectuals they're out of touch with the public. And it's they who are going to have to change, not the public. Now, Vote Leave understood not only this change in the way that people think and expect, but Vote Leave understood the constraints of conventional party politics. So we created a pop-up party. We created a party in the space of a few months that was functional and active in areas where the conventional parties have been moribund and dead for 20, 30 or 40 years. There were parts of the country where we were engaging with people at a street level that hadn't seen that sort of engagement for years. There had been fiefdom seats, one-party seats, seats that were always Tory or always Labour, where there was no grassroots activism. Now, Vote Leave created a pop-up party with 12,000 activists in the 3 months before the referendum campaign, and we delivered over 70 million leaflets using those activists. We had a system called VICS, V-I-C-S. If you're interested, Dominic Cummins on his blog site has details about it. He's since made it available to anyone who wants it. But it allowed us to collate and gather data in ways that the conventional corporate parties claim that they can do, but they can't. We also used Facebook in ways that were incredibly effective. I wasn't central to what Vote Leave did on Facebook, but I caught a slight glimpse of what was going on inside the black box. I created a series of little videos in my office. In fact, the video I had most success with was about trade. I wanted to talk about, in 2.5 minutes, how trade would change if we left the EU. I'd been invited on the Today programme to talk about it, and the interviewer hadn't allowed me. They had thrown all sorts of questions about my relationship with Nigel Farage instead. So I hadn't been able to go and talk about the things I wanted. So I went back to my office, and with the help of someone in my office, on my laptop, I made this short 2.5-minute video, put it on my Facebook account. Within about 10 days, it had been seen by 1.4 million people, slightly bigger than the audience on the Today programme. The point I'm trying to make is that it's possible, if you understand what you're doing, to bypass that priesthood of pundits who don't listen to you and appeal to a country that doesn't listen to the Today programme, but does have votes and does have opinions, even though they're not reflected by the priesthood of pundits in the commentariat. Now, so far so good. The irony I find myself facing a few weeks out from a general election is that, having been an advocate for more choice and competition and disruption in our democracy, we now find ourselves on the verge of a May monopoly. The reality is that I suspect in about 3 weeks' time we'll realise that Theresa May has total control over her cabinet, complete command of the House of Commons, and in effect will be a one-party system for at least the next five years. This should trouble all of us, particularly those of us who believe in better democracy. At the very moment when we're bringing back control of public policy by leaving the European Union, bringing back decision-making powers to Westminster, the last thing we want is a parliament full of poodles who do what Theresa May and her whips tell them, and who are incapable of actually holding the government effectively to account. What bothers me so much is that we've gone from having a cartel democracy, a two-party system, okay, to be fair to the Liberal Democrats, a 2.5-party system, to a one-party system. And it bothers me that we've almost got here by default. Now, in order for us to challenge the coming May monopoly, I think we need to recognise that we need a very different analysis to reheated 1970s socialism. That is not going to defeat the May monopoly on June the 28th this year or June 2022. I argue, and I don't want to go down that tangent, but in a book about how to take on the emerging oligarchy, that politics has become a rigged system. We have these things called elections, and we think that there's a competitive process to try and get hold of our votes. But think about it. In 4 out of 5 seats on June the 8th, in 4 out of 5 seats, there is no contest. We know who's going to be the Member of Parliament for that seat. We talk about how before the Great Reform Bill of 1832 they had pocket boroughs, rotten boroughs. What do you think 4 out of 5 seats are? It's worse than that. Look at who the Tory party is selecting to be the candidates in many of those safe seats. Do you think they're asking local people? Do you think they're opening it up? No. They're stuffing it full of cronies who've been in Downing Street already. A huge proportion of Tory MPs being picked for the safe seats are already working in Westminster. In other words, members of the legislature, think about it, members of Parliament are getting to decide who gets to sit in Parliament. It's an extraordinary short-circuiting of our democracy. Now, I think we need some fairly far-reaching and fairly radical reform. I think we need to recognise that the whole idea of having one MP per seat, it's not an old system. It was a late Victorian invention created in 1884. The very year they gave the working man the vote in this country, they created a monopolistic electoral system so that the parties could control who they voted for. Our electoral system is not an ancient part of our tradition. It is a modern invention used to make political parties central to our democracy. Our political parties, I think, are the cuckoos in the nest of our democracy. They have assumed a central role that allows the small cliques that run them to have power out of all proportion to what's right or legitimate. So I think we need electoral reform, a return to multi-member seats, 2 or 3 MPs per constituency. Incidentally, I'm not suggesting more MPs, just slightly bigger constituencies. I think we need things like the power of recall so that we can sack MPs. When I changed party, I felt it was really important that I got a mandate from the electorate in Clacton. So I resigned my seat and asked their permission. I think we need to allow voters to decide if they should call by-elections if the people that they elect aren't up to the job. But I think we need to go much further than this. We need either new parties or such big changes in the way that parties are organised that they don't look like anything we've got at the moment. If you look at all political parties, and I've been a member of 2 in the past couple of years, they're actually not that different in one really important respect. They're all basically selling us a lie. What is that lie? It's the big man, it usually is a man, sometimes it's a woman, the big man or woman myth. This idea that the person at the top of that party, cult-like, is the answer to everything. That if only you vote for Tony Blair, David Cameron, Theresa May, the world will be a better place. The world doesn't work like that. The world simply cannot be arranged by a single individual. From pharaohs in the past right through to today, to prime ministers today, no one individual can reshape the world that way. And so it invariably leaves us disappointed. Now, all parties are like this. Believe it or not, the Labour Party is trying to tell us that Jeremy Corbyn is that one individual. Even UKIP was a mini-me version of the big party. It's the great cult of a single leader. The idea that somehow, if you voted for him, the world would be a better place. What I think we need to do is recognise that if you organise political parties on that basis, the idea that a single individual is the answer, you're never going to leave people satisfied. So I think we need to try and create alternative party structures. Now, I'm told by people who understand technology that it's only a matter of months, maybe years, before we get new kinds of companies. A friend was explaining what they meant by this. They said, think of Uber, think of driverless cars. Well, sooner or later someone's going to put the two together. You'll have a fleet of driverless cars run by Uber. Then they said someone will go even better. They'll create a blockchain program so that this company won't even have anyone organising it. The blockchain will tell the driverless cars when to go off for the valet service. They will sign a contract so that automatically, after the driverless cars have been going for a few years, they're renewed. You could, in effect, create a self-driving company. Well, surely, in some ways, we could create self-selecting parties, so that you had a blockchain so that everyone who was part of that party had an equal say over candidate selection, for example. So that rather than having a party where the membership gives a small clique complete control over the machinery and invariably ends up being disappointed, you could have a party that was in effect a digital platform. You do need political parties, in a way. You need a political party to aggregate three things. To aggregate money, you've got to pay for elections. You need to aggregate messaging, and you also need some know-how of data. Not everyone knows how to do those things. But what I discovered as an MP who stood against the established parties in a seat, not just in a by-election, but in a general election, and beat them, you can do those three things without having a big corporate party behind you. And I think that knowledge of how it's done could increasingly allow us to do politics differently. Steve Hilton, David Cameron's former right-hand man, has set up CrowdPack. That allows people to aggregate money for campaigns. Now, I suspect CrowdPack is to change we need what ZX Spectrum was to computing. It's an early prototype of what could be done. But it's exciting. The idea that you don't have to be a party run by big plutocrats or bought by vested interests to raise enough money to run effective campaigns. On the VIX system that Vote Leave created on my own laptop in Clacton, I think I had a data system as good as anything that Jim Messina could produce for the Tory party. That knowledge of how you can identify target voters in key constituencies and campaign could be shared in a way that would allow ordinary people and groups and movements to compete with the established parties. I think also communication. When I first became a Member of Parliament, the very first election I ever stood in, the most important communication tool was that free election address that I got. All parties get it, funded by the taxpayer. But eventually I came to realise that the way to really communicate with people was online, was through email, was through digital. And by creating an enormous list of constituents with emails with their permission in Clacton, I was able to communicate on a level playing field with political parties that had a de facto monopoly over broadcasting during a campaign. So I think digital allows us to take on and defeat the established parties. This election, we're not going to see any of these things. But I hope that between now and 2022, some of these changes will take effect, and that we will be able to make sure that when we face that election in 5 years' time, we have a genuine, credible alternative to the monopoly system, the monochrome system, and the monochrome choices that we have when we vote today. Thank you.